Thanks for coming along tonight, folks, where Matt Thistlethwaite makes his first appearance at the Sydney Institute. I'll introduce him very briefly. He's graduated in economics and law from Sydney Universities, member for Kingsford Smith since 2013, briefly in the Senate for a couple of years before that, a former General Secretary of New South Wales Labor, a union official, and held a number of important roles in the Shadow Ministry in opposition, but was initially in the Albanese government the Assistant Minister for the Republic, and since the recent cabinet change and ministerial changes, the very important role of Assistant Minister for Immigration. The topic tonight is Migration with Meaning, how the migration strategy will benefit all Australians. Assistant Minister, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Gerard. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to acknowledge that this is Gadigal land, the traditional owners, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. It's great to see my former parliamentary colleagues Dave Bradbury and Mary Easton here tonight as well, and I want to thank Gerard, Jacqueline and the directors of the Sydney Institute for the invitation to speak tonight on this very important topic. As Gerard said, this is my first speech here at this august institution, so I feel that I've made first grade finally, and it's wonderful to be amongst you at an organisation that's done so much to promote political and social discourse in our country, and it's a very important institution that's been carrying on that tradition for close to 35 years. So it's a great honour to talk to you tonight about a pretty important topic for our nation, migration and how it can benefit all Australians. Populate or perish, that was the catch cry of Australia's post-World War II migration program. The war had accentuated Australia's small population and defence vulnerability, and our economic development had stalled with labour shortages restraining investment in new industries. With waves of displaced people throughout Europe, the Chifley government saw an opportunity to develop a plan to grow Australia's population by offering resettlement and employment in the land down under. His government established the Department of Immigration to manage the resettlement of new migrants, equivalent to about 1% of the population per year. The new Australians, as Arthur Calwell named them, came mainly from Europe, with not much more than the clothes on their back and a few words of English. Almost all of them would go on to become Australians and remain so until their passing. In total, about 4.2 million people arrived between 1945 and 1985 when the program officially ended. The migrants brought their language, their customs, their food, their sport and arts, but most importantly, they brought their skills and their labour. This pool of workers triggered a wave of government and private investment in infrastructure and industry that built the modern Australian economy, sustaining decades of improvements in living standards. Migration played a key role in providing the labour and capacity for Australia to undertake major infrastructure projects such as the Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme. In August 1949, the Snowy Scheme, one of Australia's largest and most ambitious infrastructure projects ever undertaken in Australia, commenced construction, employing thousands of newly arrived migrants. The scheme took 25 years to complete and employed more than 100,000 men and women from 30 different countries. All Australians benefited from economic developments such as that, and infrastructure and investment that triggered. In the 2 decades after the program began, the average Australian's income had grown by 327% based on weekly earnings estimates. Our economy underwent a post-war boom that lasted until the 1980s. That growth was largely driven by a rapid increase in population and the transition to manufacturing production. Without a doubt, post-war migration was a winner for Australia and for Australians. And I believe it's fair to say that most Australians would see it that way as well. There were not only the economic benefits, but the social benefits, the expanded new horizons for Australians. I've got fond memories of my grandfather who worked on the Snowy Mountains scheme telling me about the relationships and the friendships that he struck with newly arrived migrants from Italy and Greece, their new food and culture, and how that expanded the horizons and the culture of many Australians and left us with a better society. So Australians were positive about migration in that era. But I think it's also fair to say that since the 1980s, many Australians haven't had the same fondness for migration. Australia's leaders post-Chifley, including Menzies, Fraser, Whitlam and Hawke, all publicly supported an active migration program and spoke positively of the benefits that it delivered. The bipartisanship for migration post-war seemed to evaporate in the 1990s, with some civic leaders sought to stoke fear and division for political gain regarding migration rather than seeing it as a net positive for our nation. As a result, governments were reluctant to put in place a strategy for migration so that we could plan for the levels of migration required for our nation and the supports that were needed to settle new arrivals so that they could make a productive contribution to our economy. So for many decades, Australia hasn't had a migration plan. We haven't had a migration strategy. And as a result, Australia's migration policies have lacked direction and purpose. Migration's been unresponsive to Australia's needs. It's provided marginal economic benefit and hasn't enhanced labour productivity. It's been concentrated in capital cities, creating some social tension, and skill shortages have persisted despite steady flows of new arrivals with needed skills and competencies. The reliance on labour migration to solve our skills gaps has led to an underinvestment in vocational education, with commensurate falls in apprenticeships and traineeships in key sectors, particularly services, which are going to be vital to the maintenance of our standard of living with an ageing population. For the last decade, it appears that Australians have had this view that migration wasn't benefiting them as it has in the past. So to investigate why that's been occurring, our government, the Albanese government, asked Dr. Martin Parkinson to conduct a wholesale review of Australia's migration system. And his review found that the migration system was, quote, broken. Regarding migration, Dr. Parkinson said, "The objectives of the program are unclear, and successive governments and policymakers have responded to challenges through piecemeal reforms which have not addressed fundamental underlying issues. In many respects, the policies that have been adopted over the last 20 years have been bolt-on fixes to political issues rather than a clear goal or purpose for our migration system." Well, we're determined to fix that. We're determined to introduce a migration system and a strategy that ensures that it works and benefits all Australians once again. And that includes fixing the overwhelming visa backlog, the shortcomings in international education, and widespread visa system abuses. Using the recommendations of the Parkinson Review, the government's developed a migration strategy that includes a clear vision for migration in Australia and a clear set of objectives to achieve that goal. So there are five major objectives of our migration system now. They are firstly raising living standards by boosting productivity, meeting skill shortages and supporting exports. Secondly, ensuring a fair go in the workplace by complementing the jobs, wages and conditions of domestic workers and preventing migrant worker exploitation. Thirdly, building stronger communities by better planning for sustainable migration and giving migrants the opportunity to invest in their lives in Australia through permanent residence and citizenship. Fourthly, strengthening international relationships by building stronger economic and social connections with our regional neighbours and international partners. And finally, making the system work by being fast, efficient and fair for migrants and particularly employers. Under each one of these objectives, there are key actions that the government is taking to implement these goals to ensure that the migration system delivers a net benefit to Australia. To promote economic growth and productivity, we see that we must ensure Australian businesses can invest in additional production and capacity to deliver goods and services. For too long, labour shortages have been a handbrake on growth, with businesses unable to grow due to the unavailability of skills and labour needed to drive that growth in their investments. Under the previous government, migration labour grew, but there was no plan and no focus or strategy regarding the location of that growth, the types of skills required, and very little industry input into decision-making and assessment of skills needs on a regular basis. It was very much a set and forget program once it was put in place. The result was a lack of labour in key industries, persistent shortages in regional areas in particular, and an underinvestment in vocational training that's made the problem worse. All were acutely exacerbated by COVID. Our government's developed a plan to fix the skills shortages and make sure that the system is much more responsive to employer needs over the next decade. The priority for skills development must be to train more Australians in the industries where skills are needed into the future. The national economies that will thrive in the future will be those that have the skills base to support investment in innovation and emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, the net zero economy, and importantly, delivering services. To meet this challenge, investment in education and vocational training must be a priority, and it is for our government. To facilitate this, we've invested an additional $2.5 billion in vocational and tertiary training through policies such as fee-free TAFE, funding an additional 1,400 university places in STEM subjects, introducing a practical placement payment of $319 a week for students required to take on practical placements as part of their course. And importantly, we're planning the skills needs of the future through the creation of a body called Jobs and Skills Australia, a tripartite body which, through industry, unions and government working together, will plan the skills requirements for the future so that government policy is more responsive to industry need to provide a springboard for growth into the future. And that approach of Jobs and Skills Australia, of working with industry and publishing skills lists, will be regularly updated, and it will take into consideration regional differences and micro differences throughout different parts of Australia. Whilst training more Australians to acquire the skills needed in the future will also require a level of migration and labour through migration to ensure full economic potential for industry. For too long, the skilled migration system's been cumbersome and unresponsive to employers' needs. So we're reforming the temporary and permanent skilled migration pathways to ensure employers get the skilled workers they need as quickly as possible. This will be achieved through a new skills in demand visa with 3 new targeted pathways: a specialist skills pathway to attract highly skilled workers in new and emerging industries, a core skills pathway with simpler, regular, updated occupation lists, and new visa settings that give migrant workers more mobility in the labour market at lower skilled levels. In the permanent skilled pathway, we're consulting regarding reforming and reframing the points test with the state and territory governments to better identify migrants who'll drive that long-term prosperity that we need. A big focus of our government is reforming regional migration settings to ensure that regional employers get the workers they need as quickly as possible. To achieve this, we've designated regional visa processing as the highest priority, and we're evaluating the Working Holiday Maker program to ensure it supports development objectives in regional Australia and doesn't contribute to the exploitation of migrant workers. Our government's restoring integrity to our migration system through several important reforms. We're implementing caps on international student numbers and encouraging more international students to study at regional universities and vocational training institutions. This will ensure we strengthen our international education reputation by maintaining the delivery of quality tertiary education outcomes. It also allows us to properly plan for student housing to ultimately take pressure off overstretched rental markets, particularly in capital cities. We're also tackling the exploitation of visa holders and misuse of the system by allowing mobility between employers for migrants who've experienced worker exploitation at work. The Parkinson Review found that there were too many, 1.8 million, temporary migrants living in Australia. Too many of them faced a complex and lengthy pathway to permanent residence. So the government agreed that it was not in Australia's national interest to maintain a large proportion of temporary entrants who have no pathway to permanency or no future to citizenship. The review said that we needed a long-term horizon that supports stable and predictable population growth and allows more effective planning of infrastructure, housing and services to meet the needs of all Australian residents. So we're implementing a number of reforms. We're going to crack down on visa hopping, through which temporary visa holders can seek to manipulate the system by hopping from one visa to the other over longer periods and hoping to wait it out until they get to a permanent visa outcome. We're also working with the states and territories to simplify the skills points test and to reform the graduate visa system as well. Our immigration system should also ensure that we strengthen ties with our neighbours within our region, particularly in the Pacific. To achieve this, we've reformed the Pacific Australian Labour Mobility Scheme, or PALM as it's more commonly known, and we're delivering a new Pacific Engagement Visa to encourage more mobility from within our region. And both these visa schemes have been very, very popular and had huge uptake in numbers. We've also ensured that our migration system is responsive to our nation's needs in the future by working with the states and territories to plan migration over longer timeframes. And we're looking at a 4-year timeline horizon to plan migration numbers to ensure that population planning is based on the best available population forecasts and demographic features and data that's available. We'll also be conducting regular reviews of regional skill migration settings to ensure that the regions are at the forefront of migration planning. Our new migration strategy is bringing migration back to sustainable levels, ensuring that we've got the skills that we need into the future, and ultimately ensuring that we've got a system that works in the interests of all Australians. So we'd say that Australia once again has a plan for migration, has a set of principles and goals through which government, business, unions and other organisations will work for the betterment of our economy and all Australians. It's a plan that's based on the best available demographic and economic data. It's a plan that responds to the needs of industry to ensure employers have the skilled workers they need to grow their businesses. It's a plan that builds integration of new arrivals into Australian society and promotes social cohesion. It's a plan that reduces manipulation of the system and exploitation of people. And most importantly, it's a plan that will deliver economic and social benefits for all Australians, as Australians want from a migration system. So we see our mission as pretty clear: to build a migration system that earns the trust and confidence of all citizens and secures a safe and prosperous future for every Australian, just as it did in the post-war years. And we understand that the challenges of our demographics and an ageing population will be something that we need to deal with the assistance of migration into the future. Our migration system should never be a substitute for upskilling local workers, but a well-targeted migration system can help better connect migrants to Australia's skills needs. And that will contribute to productivity growth. Productivity growth has to be the key driver of our economic focus into the future. That will drive real wage growth and rising living standards over the longer term. So getting these settings right can make a real difference to the lives of all Australians. When Australians are asked to name some of the most important nation-building projects and infrastructure that they know of throughout our history, I reckon 9 times out of 10, the Snowy Mountains scheme would feature. It was an ambitious project that Australians justifiably have a lot of pride in. It's a project that was predominantly built by migrants from the other end of the earth who settled here and made Australia their home. They helped enrich our culture and expand our horizons, but most importantly, they helped modernise our economy and provided the foundation for several decades of economic growth. As we enter the innovation age, migration will play a key role in delivering the skills necessary to provide a competitive edge for our economy in the global contest for investment. We now have a plan to ensure that migration supports that investment and delivers benefits for all Australians. And we're getting on with the job of delivering it. Thanks for having me. I look forward to your questions.
So, many thanks to the Minister. So we come to questions and discussion, and we've got plenty of time. So, going back to one of your early comments, you made the point about strong migration growth from the time of the Chifley Labor government right through. I think there was a fall off in immigration in the Whitlam years, but that's half a century ago. It's half a century ago. But so in view of what you've said about that, which is correct, why do you think in recent times, is to make your point early on, that immigration's become less popular if it hasn't really changed very much in view of the relative levels of the population at the time of immigration?
Yeah. Going back longer term, I think that unfortunately some political and social leaders have seen the opportunity to use migration as an opportunity to divide the country rather than unite us, and to try and use it as a political advantage rather than show leadership and unite the country. And I think that that's a great shame, and it's probably been somewhat of a handbrake on Australia's economic development, and it's certainly affected social cohesion that's filtered down into division within society. We want to fix that and make sure that Australians see migration as something that unites us. In a more modern day context, I think that with pressure on cost of living, with pressure on housing affordability, some Australians have attempted to blame migrants for that, but I don't believe that that is true, and the reason for a lot of that pressure, particularly on housing. Nonetheless, we're putting in place measures to ensure that we do have sustainable levels of migration, but it's also about making sure that the migrants that are coming here are responsive to Australia's needs and that we benefit from them, particularly in an economic context. So tailoring those skilled migration pathways to ensure that they're more responsive, that they're more regularly updated, and that we're working on a tripartite basis to get feedback to ensure that the migration system, once again, can be something that Australians have pride in and see economic advantage in into the future.
We'll go here and then there.
Thank you. You mentioned that Australia was looking more to...
I don't think it's on.
More to the Pacific at the moment?
Yeah. That one's working.
You mentioned that Australia was looking more to the Pacific at the moment. So with the growing climate crisis, what is Australia's take as Pacific Island nations look to Australia for climate refugees and the like?
Definitely is the major issue of concern for Pacific nations. I used to be the Parliamentary Secretary for the Pacific Islands in the previous government, and whenever I'd meet with Pacific leaders, back then, this was over a decade ago, their number one concern was climate change and the effect that that was having on their societies. Many Australians see climate change as a threat in the future. For Pacific nations, it's an existential threat at the moment affecting salinity of land, affecting stable crops, affecting water, inundation of infrastructure. And they obviously want stronger action from not only Australia, but the international community to try and reduce the impacts of climate change. So the new government has been very much focused on working to support our Pacific neighbours through the Pacific Islands Forum and a number of initiatives that help combat climate change. But most importantly, taking stronger action as an economy here as well, committing to net zero, committing to a midterm target, ensuring that we've introduced a safeguard mechanism so that we've got a pathway to reducing emissions to net zero. All of those domestic policies assist as well. Regional migration for many Pacific communities is very important for their economies. For a lot of those Pacific nations, contributions to their GDP, remittances will be, in some cases, second or third biggest factors of growth in their GDP. So the Pacific Labour Mobility Scheme, Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme, got some figures here. There's 25,000 Pacific Islanders that are currently working in Australia from 10 nations. Under the Pacific Engagement Scheme, this is the new scheme that we've introduced, which is a ballot process. The PALM scheme are for temporary skilled migrants. You can come on a 9-month program or you can come on a 4-year program. The Pacific Engagement Scheme is for a permanent skilled migration pathway. 3,000 positions, there have been 56,000 applications for those positions in the ballot. I think that that's a pretty good indicator of how important that economic opportunity is for Pacific Islanders, because many of them will come here, work, and obviously send a large degree of their incomes back home that benefits not only their families back home, the economies back home in those nations as well.
Thanks, Minister. In this trajectory of things getting out of hand, where the intake hasn't really matched the needs of Australia enough, have universities really been part of this problem, in that they have used intake of overseas students to the point where they literally are dependent on them for their income, and this is causing a great deal of fuss now. How can that be fixed so that universities might be funded slightly differently and we can better control the intake of student visas?
Yeah, we think that it's become unsustainable and it's undermined quality. For certain universities, particularly in capital cities, we're now getting up to 50% of the student population being international students. So we want to make sure that the system is much more sustainable and that the numbers of students is spread more evenly across the country. There tends to be a very, very large number of international students studying at capital city universities and not many in the region. So you will have seen that the Minister for Education, Jason Clare, announced the student caps that we're putting in place of 270,000 for the next financial year. That's been introduced into the Parliament. And what that will encourage is there'll be individual caps for certain universities, but the universities that have the opportunities are the regional ones. And that's why you've seen, I know the group of 8 universities have been critical of the reform, but talk to any of the regional universities and they're very positive about it. And I met with La Trobe University last week. They're singing the praises of the policy because they see that as an opportunity. And the key, I think, is that when international students do come and study at a university in particular, even a vocational training course, they're there for 3, sometimes 4 years. They'll work in the local community, and it's our ambition and hope that they will settle in that local community, particularly in regions where they'll provide those skills that they've earned through their study into the local community and the benefit to that local community, which is what we're hearing from not only regional universities, but regional development associations and regional business chambers as well. So it's about trying to get that balance right, restore integrity to the system, and then there's a housing element of it as well. The universities that have caps will be able to go above the cap if they build more student accommodation into the future so that they can house people.
Just Just before we go to the next question, just clarification. You mentioned the Trove University based in Melbourne. You're talking about their regional campuses.
Their regional campus,
which
yes.
are, what, around the various states?
Yes, that's right.
Thanks, Gerard. All right. Minister Simon Jeans, so congratulations on being appointed. I've already sent you a letter. I practice in immigration law. I've sent you a letter on where the bodies are
I remember
buried.
reading your letter, Simon.
So I've got two issues. One is the offshore refugee program.
Yes.
Do you? One idea is to visit all the main offices and understand how that works, because that's a very important part of the migration program. And secondly, dealing with the Department of Defence and now Immigration or Home Affairs, how do you overcome the Sir Humphrey Applebys who will want to keep you in the dark, and what's your best strategy?
Okay, certainly the role that the UNHCR plays in the offshore migration program is vitally important, and we take the advice of those experts about where we bring migrants from, and obviously it's based on urgency and need. We take their advice about where the most urgent settlement options are. I have visited a number of refugee camps. I've been to the Rohingya refugee camp in the past, not in this role. And I've seen the great work that UNHCR and other organisations do and the urgency and need that exists there. We've got a humanitarian program of 20,000 per year. There's got offshore and onshore elements to that. Obviously, we'd like to maximise the offshore element through the UNHCR, and hopefully some of the reforms that we've put in place, like real-time processing of protection visas, are helping with that. And the evidence that we're getting so far is that scheme seems to be working. In terms of the Sir Humphrey Appleby question, I think that anyone that's been a minister knows that the people that work in the Australian Public Service are very, very dedicated, and they work very hard. And I want to thank the officials that I've been working with at Home Affairs and the Migration and the Immigration Department. They've been very supportive. Their briefs are fantastic. A couple of weeks ago I was in Broome with the Australian Border Force Commissioner Michael Outram, seeing the great work that our Border Force staff doing combating illegal fishing in the north, the work that they're doing around customs and trying to open up regional airports to international arrivals. So when I was there, I viewed the inbound flight from Singapore, one of the first that's restarted in Broome, so people can come directly from Asia into a tourist hotspot for Australia, again where they've faced skill shortages in the past, and the person that checked me into the hotel was a Canadian on a working holiday, make a visa, and the person that served me at the cafe in the afternoon was a palm worker from the Pacific Islands. So all of that contributes to the advancement of our economy, and a great example of the microcosm of the work that goes on in the public service, helping achieve that economic benefit.
Question that's come through about, she says the minister made the point about the emphasis on regional Australia and migrants go in there. The question is, how extensive is the Commonwealth Government's power to tell people, including immigrants, where they can live?
Yes.
It is limited, but to what extent is it limited?
So we don't tell people where they can live, but we provide incentives for them to settle in regional areas. So if an employer in a regional area wants to bring a skilled worker to work on their property, in their business in a regional area, they will get fast-track processing. So regional applications for skilled visas will go to the top of the list. And generally they will be processed in about 10 days, so it's quite quick. There can be hold-ups in skills accreditation, which is another issue that we're trying to work on speeding up. However, we give priority. So that provides the incentive for people. If they're looking to come to Australia and to work here, if you want to get here quickly, make your labour and your services available to a regional employer, and you'll get a faster track here to Australia. So we're not forcing people, we're providing incentives. The other element of it is trying to work with regional development organisations through an organisation called MAXIM, the Ministerial Advisory Council on Skilled Migration, where we've got a regional subcommittee that's currently working on a number of small projects that will hopefully reduce some of the bottlenecks and speed up the processing of regional skilled visas, and importantly advise the government about how we can support newly arrived skilled migrants on their visa journey and encourage them to settle here in a regional area. What do we need to do to make that regional settlement attractive to newly arrived migrants?
So just to follow up this question, so what does the question would amount to this? What success do you have in encouraging people to stay where they go in view of that you can't control it? Do you find that they do that? I mean, to someone who has to go to Bathurst for a university or a job, do they tend to stay there, or they go back to Sydney or Brisbane or what?
Anecdotally, and I don't have any statistics to back this up, but anecdotally, I think if you have kids that are in the local school, there's a much bigger chance, and that both parents are employed, there's a much bigger chance that they will stay within that region. And then they're part of the community. The kids will be playing in the local soccer club, going to the local school. They're integrated into that regional community and they feel part of that community. And quite often you'll see people who may be coming to the end of their temporary visa journey, that the community will rally behind trying to get that person a permanent visa because they've become part of the community. The community sees that they're making a significant contribution, and they see them as Australians, and they want them to be Australians. So quite often we will get lobbied to provide that permanent pathway for them.
Minister, we've been seeing how in the United States in their election campaign immigration has been quite a polarising debate. How do you propose to sell this given that we are coming up to a federal election, and what do you think the barriers are for that? We've seen some pretty ugly episodes in our history. I'm thinking of a few things like Indian students being targeted for violence, other pockets. Have you thought how you're going to manage to sell this?
Yeah, I think there's two elements to it. Firstly, we need to explain to Australians the economic benefit and the benefit that they derive from it as well. Demographics aren't on Australia's side. A shocking statistic is that over the course of the next 25 years, the number of Australians over the age of 85 will double. That is going to put a massive impost on our healthcare system and our aged care system, and indeed the NDIS. So we're going to need to train and skill up a lot of Australians to deliver those services into the future. Unfortunately, we're simply not going to be able to do it through the domestic workforce. There's going to be a requirement for some skilled migration to assist with that. So if Australians want to maintain that quality of life of getting access to good health and aged care services, we're going to need to have some level of skilled migration to ensure that all Australians have the opportunity at that. So there's an economic imperative. The second one is that I think that we all benefit from social cohesion and unity rather than division and political point scoring. And that's a leadership role, and that's a leadership issue. It's very easy to stoke division around migration, but the right thing to do and the leadership that we need people to take is to say, no, there's an economic benefit in this, our nation needs it, and we need to work together to do our best to settle new migrants and to provide them with opportunities to integrate and feel part of Australian society.
Minister, thanks for your presentation tonight. You spoke in answer to the last question about the importance of social cohesion, and you said in your speech that there'd been a deterioration in the community support for immigration over past levels. Now, we may have romantic notions that there was greater integration by those earlier influxes of migrants from Greece and Italy post-war. Do you have a comment in relation to the level of integration that we're now seeing from the last 2 decades of immigration?
With the right level of support, integration works well. And I see it in my local community. I've got a number of organisations that provide settlement services to newly arrived migrants. And they're probably much better than they were in the 50s and 60s because now all adults will get access to adult migrant English program. Kids will get access to school straight away. If they require housing support, if they require social services support, they'll get access to that. So where they've been exposed to those settlement services and they work through those settlement services, I think that the outcomes are quite good. Obviously, you can lead the horse to water, but you can't make them drink. You've got to provide the opportunities, and hopefully people will participate in those programs. And hopefully people will see them as an opportunity to broaden their horizons and to gain new skills and integrate into Australian society. So I think that the programs that assist those migrants to settle and to integrate are vitally important.
I've got another question here. And this question goes to you mentioned about reviews, and the question is, has there ever been, I think the questioner suggests that Barry Jones used to go on about this, but has there ever been a detailed inquiry into population policy, either by the Productivity Commission or some other government-formed commission? And if not, is there a need for this?
I'm not aware of one in my time in politics. There is the intergenerational reports that are done on a regular basis by Treasury, which predict demographic factors and where governments should be making investments in the future, particularly around service delivery and in government expenditure to support those demographic needs into the future. But this is partly what the migration strategy is all about as well. It's about ensuring that we're doing a better job at planning what we want from the migration system so that we know with a bit more certainty what the numbers are going to be over a longer time frame. Instead of doing it on an annual basis, we're looking at doing it on a 4-year time frame. So there's better planning, taking into consideration the intergenerational report, other demographic reports and data. But then being able to plan where you need the infrastructure to support that, what the employers need to make migration a success, and how you deliver better social outcomes through the delivery of settlement services. So we think that having a plan for migration is the best way to go about ensure that we get better outcomes from our migration system.
Minister, about 20 years ago I got involved in Villawood and helping refugees and whatever. We even had one Ghanaian young woman live with us for 3 years. But I gather we've stopped boats and all that, but I gather there's a great backlog of people who came under what we would say unlawful ways. Have we been able to do something about that? Because put aside those cases where people were criminals, whatever, the majority of those people are decent, ready to be hardworking, and they get caught up in an enormous amount of red tape with the Immigration Department. And I've been there, done that. It's just woeful. Is there some way we could kind of do a proper audit on all of this and streamline these people? Because they're out in the community, they're trying to live without any proper status. Often they have children, and there must be a way we can clean the whole thing up now that we're not being invaded, as it were, by boats.
Yeah, so there's a plan in place to ensure that we deal with particularly the cohort that arrived prior to the Pacific solution being put in place by the Rudd government, and there's thousands of those, and we're working on a plan to ensure a pathway for those people. We've instituted a resolution of status visa, which assists with that. We got rid of temporary protection visas, which were providing that uncertainty for many people. And there's a plan that's being put in place to settle that issue into the future, and something will be announced on that quite soon.
Now, I've got a question here. Just hang on. I've got a question, not this one, this one, about... Now, the questioner says that he knows that your responsibility is essentially immigration. You're not the Home Affairs Minister.
That's right.
But the question about security checks on refugees or asylum seekers who come from places like Gaza,
Yes.
or other civil war zones like Syria was, how can that be handled in a very difficult situation where a lot of people come in a great deal of, in a great hurry?
Yep.
How can that be handled if that's your role and may not be your role?
Anyone that comes to Australia on a visa undertakes a character and health check. The character check involves a criminal record check and any other background information that the department may be aware of in respect to that person. So that's for every single person who comes to Australia on any particular type of visa. On top of that, there's a process that's undertaken by ASIO that has a movement alert list. And ASIO can place anyone on that movement alert list at any time, and it's updated on a daily basis. And the movement alert list are people that may be a security risk to Australia, that may have been involved in activities in another country that would be a red flag to an application for a visa here in Australia. So in recent times, there's obviously been a number of people that have come from Israel, that have come from Gaza. Every one of them would have gone through the character and health assessment process. Some of them would have gone through the ASIO process. About 7,200 of those were refused. So quite a number of them have been rejected. There's been some political commentary about it. In the Parliament, there was a bit of argy-bargy about it. But I want to make the point that the process that was undertaken by the previous government is the exact same process that this government is undertaking when it comes to checking the character, the health, and the security threats of anyone coming to Australia. The process hasn't changed. It's exactly the same.
You want me to read it out? Someone in the audience wants me to read out the question. What incentives are in place to attract skilled Australian diaspora abroad to return to Australia and perhaps even contribute to skills training initiatives within Australia?
Good question. The great thing about Australians is that we love to travel, and many of them have the opportunity to take those skills elsewhere. And I see David Bradbury in the audience here, who's just spent well over a decade working with the OECD and putting his skills into practice at a very, very senior level around international taxation policy. And I think that at any one time you're going to have quite a number of Australians who are working overseas. We're an adventurous lot. We like to expand our horizons. But like David, I think many Australians see that we've got a pretty good country here. We've got a very, very good education system. We've got a very, very good social safety net, and it's an attractive place to live. And that's why so many from throughout the world do want to come and settle here, and unfortunately we don't have the number of positions available for the demand that we have. So we have these policies and these strategies in place to make sure that we benefit as a country from the economic advantages of particularly skilled migration, humanitarian migration, family reunion and other types of migration, so that, as I said earlier, and the focus of the speech was that all Australians benefit.
Final question. Assume that the Albanese government gets returned at the next election, and assume that you're in the same job that you're in now. In, say, in a year's time, what would you think you'd be able to tell us beyond what you've told us tonight? I mean, what would your main initiatives be in the short term?
Two things. Providing a bit more certainty for regional employers. We've got a consultation process going on at the moment about how we can improve the responsiveness of regional migration and the skilled settings. So we released a discussion paper. We've had consultations throughout the country, and we're now working on the recommendations that come from that, and they'll be implemented in the new year, probably post-election if we're re-elected. And secondly, trying to restore integrity to the system to ensure that some of the manipulation of the system that existed in the past is reduced, and that the visa categories are there for the reasons that they were put in place for, and that they contribute to sustainable economic development and a better society for Australia. Thank you.
So a lot of people here and we're all busy, so I'd be very brief. Look, tonight we've heard a very comprehensive speech from the Minister, and he's taken about 30 minutes of questions and discussion, and we can't ask more of a busy Minister than that. So for tonight, well done, and we'd love to have you back in the future.